يلا.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I know a lot of you, so there's a lot of familiar faces. So those of you who know me are going to be bored with this introduction, I guess. But my name is V. My pronouns are they, she. I am an assistant professor of psychology at AUB. I hate my field, and I'll tell you a bit more about it. So I'll make some disclaimers before starting with the talk altogether. But before I get started, I want to mention that yesterday was the International Day for Solidarity with the Palestinian people, also known as Palestine Day. It's clearly very important to me because I'm Palestinian. I'm a third-generation Palestinian refugee from Lebanon. And the fact that we're talking about decolonizing knowledge tonight, we have to acknowledge the fact that we don't live in a post-colonial world, right? So most theorizing around decolonizing anything assumes that we live in a post-colonial context. But 100 kilometers down south in Palestine, people are fighting every day and resisting every day to free the land, to get their land back, and they're fighting settler colonialism. So I just wanted to acknowledge that yesterday on Palestine Day, we lost 4 martyrs to the Israeli occupation forces and their violence. So I just wanted to acknowledge our martyrs in Palestine, Mufid, Dafir, and Jawad, who are 20 and 21-year-old brothers. They were both killed yesterday. Ra'id Nasan, another 21-year-old, and Rani Abu Ali, a 41-year-old father of 4. I'm doing this while experiencing a lot of pain, but I do think that this moment is very important for us to first acknowledge the resistance in Palestine. I want to, make sure that we frame everything in the fact that 100 kilometers down south, there's a actual battle to decolonize. There's an actual fight for liberation happening. So this is not just some academic bullshit, right? Most of it will be academic bullshit, but it's not academic bullshit. It's real life and livelihood. So free Palestine. Yeah. Okay, so my talk today is titled Decolonizing Knowledge Towards Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And in this talk, I plan on doing the following. First, I'll contextualize why knowledge is colonial, in a sense, at least most knowledge that we have. And then I'll talk about academic knowledge production problems. I'll focus on academic knowledge because that's my area of expertise. That's where I function and operate, and that's where I do my knowledge production. Then I'll go to decolonizing academic knowledge production. I'll lay out some strategies that we can actually use in our work for all of you who are researchers in the social sciences or aspiring researchers. Those, of course, also apply to your fields of study. I'll discuss some paths forward, but mostly what I'm most interested in today is having a discussion about how we can really implement these strategies, right? To move them beyond just theorizing and thinking to actual practice in how we generate and formulate knowledge. So with that comes a few disclaimers. So first, as I said, I operate within psychology, which is, I think, one of the most colonial fields of study in the social sciences, right? It's a very neoliberal field of study. It's one that's highly focused on the individual and individual needs and intrapsychic processes, and doesn't really take into account material factors and structural issues that influence these intrapsychic processes. Now, I'm a social and political psychologist, so I hope that I do it a little bit better by taking into account structures of oppression and inequality, and thinking of how those influence psychological processes. But still, it's a terrible field of study. First disclaimer. Second disclaimer, I operate from within a very colonial setting, right? So AUB is the hub of colonialism in the region. And we have to, don't tell that to my employers, I need my job for a livelihood. But I mean, it's a very colonized space, the institution has an agenda. It's been a very clear agenda for the past 150 years, and it's a very colonial agenda. So another disclaimer out of the way. The third disclaimer is I'm giving this talk in English, right? And we're talking about decolonizing knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, and my mother tongue is Arabic. But my comfort zone in terms of how I can communicate my work and I can communicate my knowledge is in English. So it's important to self-reflect on the processes within ourselves that are colonial in nature. And one of them is the fact that I'm doing this in English. I know some of you are also more comfortable listening and thinking in English and even writing in English. I am for sure. I try not to be. I'm doing this 3-day workshop next week, fully in Arabic, and I'm giving like an hour lecture in Arabic, and I'm terrified, right? It's scary as hell. Okay, so let's get started by talking about the coloniality of knowledge. I want to start with a quote from one of the most influential people to my thinking, someone who's also a psychologist who was actually the first psychologist to talk about coloniality and being a colonial subject and what that entails. And it's Frantz Fanon, of course. Fanon said, in the colonial context, the settler only ends his work of breaking in the native when the latter admits loudly and intelligibly the supremacy of the white man's values. So in a sense, Fanon focused a lot on how we internalize colonialism, how it becomes a process of how we perceive ourselves, how we think about ourselves, and how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the colonizer. So in a sense, we start thinking about the systems of knowledge that are produced by the colonizer and using the ways and methods to produce that knowledge as superior to indigenous means of knowledge. He calls this process psychologically the internalization of inferiority, and it's, I think, a good starting point for all of us to start thinking through these issues, considering we're all colonial subjects here in many ways, shapes, and forms. So the colonizer plays a very active role in terms of shaping how colonial knowledge is superior to indigenous forms of knowledge, right? So they impose some images of their own patterns of knowledge production that give greater meaning and greater value to those systems. In the beginning of any colonial process, and I mean colonial in the traditional term, right? You walk into a space, you colonize it, you pillage its resources, and then you use your missionaries to try to transmit colonial ways of knowledge to, the commoners, to spread civilization, to civilize the uncivilized. And the first way of doing that is placing patterns of knowledge far out of the reach of the dominated. So the colonizer walks into a space that they want to pillage, and they say that any kind of knowledge produced in that space is meaningless, right? It's uncivilized, it doesn't make any sense, it doesn't follow scientific methods, it's just not meaningful. So that's the starting point. The second point is letting in some elements of the context that is being colonized into getting to know the colonizer's knowledge. This is, for example, when elites are co-opted in whichever space is being colonized. So you walk in, you have the political elites, the leaders, the people who have money and material resources that the colonizer wants to bring into their side. They want them to support the colonial project. So they allow them access to that knowledge. They allow them access to universities, allow them access to education in the colonial contexts. And after that, and with the process of engaging some elements of the indigenous population, but those, again, are elite elements, right? So these are the top echelons of the society being colonized who are getting access to the colonizer's knowledge, to the universities of the colonizer, for example, to the books and the knowledge production and so on. And after that, when some elements of the folks who are in the colonial context are contributing to saying and shaping the conversation around this and saying that, okay, the colonizer's knowledge production means are superior, in fact, and we actually all need to do this, in a sense that paints European, by the way, when I say colonizers, I'm mostly referring to white European cultures. I know there's histories of colonization that are different and non-European, but if we're talking about, the last few centuries, most colonization was practiced by European countries on non-European countries. So it's the white man and woman and white folks in general who I pit as the colonizer in this context. So after that process of bringing in indigenous folks into the colonial process, European culture is made to be seductive. It's portrayed as what's aspirational, right? So if you have access to that knowledge, you have more power. I can give you an example of my dad. I am the first person in my family to go to college, right? And he made it a point ever since I was a kid to make sure that he busts his ass to get me a college education, but where specifically? At AUB, right? Because if I am to gain any access or any power in my space and my existence as a Palestinian, I have to be validated by these colonial systems of knowledge. And in that sense, I think many of us can relate to that, relate to accessing elite education, these elite education institutions being those that are Western, those that are, non-local, right? So this establishes the European model of knowledge as the universal cultural model of knowledge. So in a sense, with that, European and colonizer ways of being and existing are portrayed as the pinnacle of human progress, as the aspiration, as what we should all be aiming towards, right? This includes things like the concept of democratic countries or governance being thought of as the only way of progress in societies. So when you think of the US invading Iraq, right, to rid it of its dictatorship, rid it of its authoritarian people, and spread democracy.
So ironically, they put there in the first place.
Exactly. So with that, you can think about how European forms of being, whether it's knowledge, whether it's systems of governance, are those that are thought of as superior, the pinnacle of human progress. And this also applies to ways of knowledge production around the physical sciences, even medicine. If you think about, when we think about medicine, we're all thinking about Western medicine, right? We're not thinking about indigenous ways of healing. Actually, most people would not go to indigenous healers and would rather go to, Western practitioners or people who practice Western medicine because it's pitted against indigenous ways of healing as superior. That also applies to the social sciences, where we think of methods that use quantitative tools and the scientific method as superior to other methods of inquiry, such as oral history. And also to global policy. I'm not going to tap into global policy a lot because that's its own beast. So in order to engage in decolonial liberation, we have to start thinking about practicing and putting forth alternative ways of being, right? Of existing in the world, but also of putting ideas into the world. So we need both new epistemologies, but also new methodologies. And by new, I want to caveat. I don't mean new as in we need to create methodologies, right? Ways of knowledge production that are indigenous and rooted in cultural practices have existed as far as, civilizations and cultures have existed. So we're not really creating something from scratch. We're actually just tapping into the roots and trying to undo this idea that colonial ways of knowledge are superior. And to do that, we have to, of course, draw on the experiences of societies, of cultures, of collectives within their context rather than adopting frameworks that are external to that context. So next, I'm going to tap into what is, I think, very important for me as a researcher, which are the problems of knowledge production and how knowledge production is colonial in its own way. And I'll do that by asking a few questions. But the first thing I want to do is I want to put forth this argument that academic knowledge production reflects and portrays ways of knowing and being that are predominantly what we call, in psychology at least, weird, right? Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So most knowledge we have in the social sciences stems from researchers who belong to those groups and who have that background, but also participants and research subjects who come from those backgrounds too. And then we take that knowledge and we assume that it applies universally across people and across cultures. So that's the problematic that I'm going to try to unpack by asking a few questions. And these weird ways of knowing and existing are what is perpetuated as the hegemonic way of being. So the first question I ask is, who decides what knowledge is produced? I mean, we are in a small local organization now, right? And I'm pretty sure y'all have trouble with funders and with getting money and with funders telling you what to do and how to operate and what kind of research to do and what kind of knowledge to produce, right? Exactly what you're allowed to do. And even if you're doing something that's subversive, right, something that's different from other ways of doing research and doing your work, you would have to kind of like frame it in ways that would be okay for your donors. In academic spaces, we function very similarly because our work is for us to be able to sustain our work is contingent on getting grants, right? Most of these granting bodies come from the West. They come from countries, they come from big organizations that have their own agendas, that are advancing a neo-colonial project, an imperialist neoliberal project. So we're all bound by where the money comes from and what the money is dictating for us to do. So the agendas of most donors tend to be very westernized, not very culturally sensitive, and not reflective of the processes that are important to study and investigate on the ground. And the people who determine where the money goes and how the money is spent are those who hold a lot of power and who are centralized within the global north and within Western contexts. So who gives us the money determines what kind of work we do for the most part. The second question, and a very important one, is where is most knowledge produced? If we're talking about academic knowledge, if you open any academic journal and you read the affiliation of the first authors, at least in those journals, most of them are probably going to be from institutions in the global north. Academic institutions that are elite, that are top tier, you know, we're talking your Ivy Leagues, your most prestigious universities in the US, in Canada, in the UK. Those are the folks who get a platform to publish and generate knowledge within academic circles. And most of these researchers are located, unfortunately, in the global north. Their labs are centralized there. And even if it's researchers who come from, you know, let's say it's Arab researchers who come from our region, most of those who will get access to publish and produce knowledge are those who are operating within the confines of global north institutions and elite institutions as well. And when knowledge is produced outside academia, it's produced in two different ways, right? One of them could be in big international organizations, and these international organizations themselves have neocolonial agendas, right? You have the center in the global north, and then you have a franchise across, you know, the Arab countries or what have you. And if you're producing knowledge in local organizations like where we are right now, these local organizations are held captive by donor agendas, so they can't really produce the knowledge that they might want to produce or aspire to produce. The following question is, who produces the knowledge, as in the individuals who are producing the knowledge? Most individuals who produce knowledge are prominent researchers, mostly white men and women from the global north. Even if they're producing knowledge on spaces that are not the global north, right? So if you look at least I can reflect on political psychology. If you look at most political psychology research done in the Arab region or on the Arab region, most of the researchers who have produced this work are white men. What do they know, right? And if it is, let's say you're producing knowledge in an international organization. I'm not going to name, right? No naming, no shaming, but you all can conjecture these organizations in your minds, I think. So if an international organization is producing knowledge, usually the projects that are held in spaces, let's say in the Arab region, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Syria, big project, knowledge production on, I don't know, mobilization, collective action, trauma. Everybody loves studying trauma in our region, right? So the teams who do these research tend to be teams that are led, for the most part, by global north white researchers who have no idea of the context. They just come into the franchise that they have of that organization here and start working as if, you know, they have that knowledge, the indigenous knowledge of the space that they're working in, and they don't. So who produces knowledge is also part of the problem. It's not us producing knowledge about us, it's others producing knowledge about us. And one of the more important questions, I think, and it speaks to the coloniality of knowledge, but also it speaks to the capitalistic modes of production within academia specifically, is why is knowledge produced? I can be very frank about this and say most academics, at least academics who are trained in the global north, are publishing for their own career advancements, including myself, right? My promotion, my tenure, any academic working in an academic institution is their livelihood, their career advancements are hinged on how many journal articles they publish in prestigious outlets, right? So at the end of the day, you're producing for self-motivated needs, and that means your research might be less thoughtful than you want it to be, it might be less grounded than you want it to be, but it also might be just popcorn, what I call popcorn research, fast, just get it out. There's actually a term that's extensively used in academic training in the US, which is the publish or perish paradigm. So if you don't publish as an academic, you're going to die. Your career is just going to die. So imagine if that's the motivating force for most people functioning within academia. What kind of research are we really capable of doing? How impactful, how meaningful, how grounded will that research be? We'd rather publish an article that takes, a year from writing to publication rather than do a very complex project that would take 4 or 5 years to implement. Because by the end of those 4 or 5 years, that academic's career is gone. Yeah, okay. So, also, if we don't publish, we don't get grants. If we don't produce knowledge, even at the organizational level, not just at the academic level, we don't get the funds needed to do more research. So we circle back to this idea of who is giving the money and why do we need the money to do the work? And it's all really centralized and controlled by a few actors who are setting forth the agenda for most research. And the final question that I'll ask is, which knowledge is more valued? And I'll reflect a little bit on colonial systems of knowledge, at least within the social sciences. So when we receive training as social scientists, there's two, I would call them very broadly, two schools of methodology, right? You're either trained, or you might receive training in both schools, but you're either trained in quantitative methodology, so you're doing survey research or experimental research, that's how I got most of my training, or you're trained in qualitative methodology, things like case studies, ethnographies, grounded theory, and so on. And most of the time, research that is rooted in numbers, so quantitative research, is held at greater value than qualitative research methods. And qualitative research methods are, if we are to look at indigenous systems of knowledge production, right, things like oral history, that's purely qualitative research. There's nothing quantitative about it, which means that if you are producing work that uses methodologies less valued than quantitative methodologies, that work, that knowledge is not going to be perceived as valuable. It's not going to be thought of as something that is important and meaningful, at least within academic circles. But also, knowledge that is produced, and here's some academic jargon again. In academia, when you're publishing a journal article, you can submit it to various outlets, right? But there's a very strict ranking system in which those outlets are ranked. So you're encouraged as an academic to publish in what we call Q1 journals, so the highest ranked journals. By the way, work that is published in these journals, most of you can't access and can't read. You might have to pay like $30 or $35 for a single article to be able to access it. So bless LibGen and Easy Library for giving us free access to academic knowledge. But still, knowledge that's produced outside of these Q1 journals that are subscription only, that are available only in elite institutions, is much less valued as well. So I think I laid out the problematic, I think. Does anyone have questions so far? Or should I move forward and leave the discussion till the end? What do y'all think? Questions? Shall we keep going? Okay, I still have like 5 more minutes, I think. So we can have an open discussion after, of course. So we'll get to the more practical but also theoretical part of this whole thing, which is how do we decolonize knowledge production? And the short answer is, it's very difficult. We are still, as researchers and people involved in research, thinking through it. What I'll give is some answers that have been generated by some decolonial scholars in the field of psychology, specifically social and cultural psychology. So it's very discipline specific, but I also think that it does apply to the social sciences more broadly and to a lot of the work that many of you are probably doing in your day-to-day lives. So in terms of this broad umbrella of decolonizing knowledge, right? So what do we want to do when we're decolonizing knowledge? We have basically two broad goals when it comes to the decolonial process of knowledge production. And the first goal is a critical goal. It's a critical aim. We want to lay out the fact that considering what knowledge is valued, what knowledge is thought of as more important, we need to kind of shed light on the fact that these are colonial systems of knowledge. We need to make that clear. We need to explain that there are other modes of knowledge production and that the hegemony of colonial means of knowledge production is an actual problem. It's a problem because it's silencing, it's oppressive, it's not really grounded in the realities of the people we're supposed to be studying or shedding light on. But also we need to think about this critical aim as a mode of self-critique, right? So I started with the quote from Fanon. And Fanon really focused on the idea of internalizing inferiority, on the fact that us as researchers from the global south, right, oftentimes rely on colonizer ways of doing research, of doing knowledge production, of doing knowledge dissemination. So we also need to look at what we're doing. I need to examine myself and think, why am I giving this talk right now in English, right? Why am I relying on papers in this talk that were produced in English in Q1 journals that are not accessible to almost everyone in the audience? So we need to start by critiquing ourselves and our positionality as well. So it's not just critiquing the colonizer, it's also engaging in some self-reflection and self-critique as well. But there's also a reconstructive aim. So we're not all about just saying, okay, there's a problem, we need to do something about the problem. We need to reconstruct how we are producing knowledge. And that is done, I know this is going to be a very big term, that's done by creation of more liberatory knowledge frameworks. What do we mean by liberatory knowledge frameworks? We'll discuss that soon, hopefully. But we need to start going back to indigenous resistance, and I'll talk about that first. So let me not rush into it. So within social and cultural psychology, researchers have thought of three ways in which we can approach decolonizing knowledge production. Those are indigenous resistance, accompaniment, and denaturalization. My personal approach would be indigenous resistance is the way to go. This is what we should be doing, and I'll explain why very shortly. By indigenous resistance, I mean that we should go back to locally grounded researchers and practitioners and reclaim their wisdom, reclaim their ways of knowing and telling. You know, for instance, oral history has been used in our region specifically, but especially in Palestine and among the Palestinians in Bishatat, extensively to document the history of Nakba, the history of existence in the diaspora. So oral history has been used extensively as a very important tool of maintaining and transmitting knowledge from generation to generation. Oftentimes it's not very formalized into writing, right? It just takes on the oral form. But we need to think about, why is the oral form of transmitting knowledge less valued as a legitimate source of knowledge than the written form, for instance? So that's one of the things that we could examine when thinking about indigenous resistance. And with indigenous resistance, the hope or the goal is that people on the ground and from the ground are producing knowledge about their communities and for their communities. So there's less of an extraction there, right? It's less of people coming from abroad, living with a community for a year, getting to know people, writing a paper, submitting it or giving a talk at an academic conference somewhere in Wisconsin, and then talking to a bunch of white people about, the Palestinians that they met in the camps in Lebanon. So it's about the Palestinians in the camps in Lebanon generating knowledge about the Palestinians in the camps in Lebanon, right? That's the whole point of indigenous resistance. And with that, we need to start normalizing indigenous modes of knowledge production. Again, I said indigenous modes of knowledge production are oftentimes sidelined as, important but not really impactful as knowledge, because it cannot be read. It's transmitted in languages that are localized and that are less accessible to, the broader community. So they're given less value, although they're very important tools of producing knowledge. But there are so with every strategy of these three strategies that I'll discuss, I'll also talk about some limitations to them. And one of the limitations to indigenous resistance is what we call romantic conservatism, which is, rejecting any kind of dynamic cultural adaptation and saying that it kind of goes against our culture. So for instance, we're in a very queer space, right? We're mostly local queer folks, right? If we are to produce knowledge or to, let's say, put out a research project that examines the lived queer experience of folks in Lebanon using oral history methods, right? And we're trying to communicate that knowledge that we produced from that project. We might get a lot of pushback from societal factors that would say queerness is inherently not Arab, right? Or something that goes against our cultural principles and our societal principles. So there might be this conservative pushback against things that are not seen as essential to the cultural experience. I'll always circle back to the context of Palestine because it's the one that matters most to me. A lot of queer organizations in Palestine do have this tension and this struggle when producing knowledge, considering that some elements of society would want to focus more on the decolonial liberation struggle, right? And sideline, or at least put aside for a bit, the struggle of queer Palestinians within that colonial context. But they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Queers have always existed. The queer struggle for liberation has always existed, and it does not necessarily need to be antagonistic to the liberatory struggle from the colonial forces. It's actually quite compatible. So that's one of the limitations, I think, of indigenous resistance. The next strategy, which is, I think, I don't like both of the strategies, but considering the fact that, global North researchers are still going to do their research, are still going to want to come into our spaces and extract knowledge, right? The second strategy is accompaniment. Accompaniment refers to when researchers leave the ivory tower, that is the academy, and the comfort of their own spaces in their happy-go-lucky universities, and actually do come to the ground and live in the spaces that they are intending to study, get to know people from the communities that they're intending to study. For instance, ethnography is one of those methodologies where researchers use the accompaniment tool. And it's a good tool because in one way, it's a good tool because it's actually grounded. The person is not just sitting behind their desk and trying to theorize about those others that live in a space that's so different from theirs and have a completely different lived experience. So there's presence and there's active learning on part of the Global North researchers or even the indigenous researchers who work in Global North organizations. But But the problem with this approach is that it could actually enable and foster colonial practices like epistemic extractivism. You know, the researchers coming into these contexts could just be gathering data for the purpose of gathering data, extracting from the locals, right? Learning from their experiences, but then again, never seeing them ever again. And that happens most often with this method, where researchers come in. We know it a lot in Lebanon. We see it all around us. People coming in, you know, staying here for a year, doing their research or their field work, and then going back to the comfort of their ivory tower, writing their papers in English, never speaking again to any of their participants, communicating to, you know, audiences that are mostly white, mostly global north based, and then just using that data for their own career advancements. So they're extracting. And this extraction is colonial, inherently colonial. You're taking resources, and that resources is information, it's data, it's lived experience. Exactly. Exactly. It perpetuates colonial modes of doing things in colonized spaces, except this time what you're extracting is not necessarily, you know, gold or ivory. What you're extracting is information about lived experiences and about culture. So it's definitely extractive and exploitative, and it perpetuates the same patterns of colonial knowledge production. But also, with that comes the white savior industrial complex, you know? When white researchers trained in Harvard, no offense to anybody here, when white researchers trained, well, maybe some offense, sorry, trained in spaces like Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge, right? They come in and think, you know, we have the money, we have the tools, we need to pick up these locals, we need to, you know, teach them how to do research. We need to talk to them. We need to tell their story to the world, right? What do you think is the problem with that approach? Anyone? Yeah. Exactly. You're stripping your subjects of agency. What else? From the side of the researchers? Absolutely, right? They're coming in with their own preconceived knowledge about what the processes they're expecting are. Yes? It's infantilizing. Exactly. Like, we can save you, right? Exactly. Exactly, exactly. So we don't need to be taught how to tell our stories. Yes, Anna?
Also romanticizes if it's the poverty,
Mm-hmm.
whatever they're coming
The trauma.
And they're mostly like in spaces where like they want to take the sad story.
Of course.
The struggle.
Of course. And it's always the sad stories, right?
Success story. Success story.
Success story. That's what you all have to deal with.
How did it save your community?
Exactly. What did Haven do to protect the queers? Yeah. What do you mean?
People I'm from Central Asia,
Yeah.
and we portrayed as wild people who run on the horses,
Yeah.
or something like this.
Yeah, exactly.
So the narrative makes us like exotic.
Oh yeah, okay, now I get what you mean. Absolutely, there's always this narrative of, you know, I mean, Edward Said called it Orientalism, right? The Orientalist view, and a big part of Orientalism was this idea of this outsider looking in and trying to, you know, explain the savage behavior of these various locals who can all be lumped into one category. Yes, Farah. Exactly. They're not technically trying to save us, right? They're trying to maintain their hegemony and their dominance at the end of the day, and the dominance of their ways, their means, their theorizing, their ideas, their systems of living. Yes, hello. Hi. Absolutely. 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 And we see that a lot with gender research too. I do a ton of gender research, right? And I see how, we get researchers or collaborators trying to, shed light on the experience of the Arab woman, right? The oppression that is faced by the Arab woman, just to make sure to advance the Arab woman's rights. We don't hear from them after they leave. They take the information and go, and nothing happens. So it's just pure extraction. And extraction is the first colonial imperial tool. It's not extraction of material resources per se. It could be, you're extracting time from your participants in the communities that you're engaged in research with, and that time may be used to generate income for low-income families or people experiencing poverty. So it is extraction of resources, different kind of resources, but still extraction. And the last strategy is the strategy of denaturalization. Hi! Is a strategy of denaturalization. So denaturalization refers to having conversations and discussions within academic spaces about the colonization of knowledge, right? Trying to denormalize these standard regimes of knowledge production and illuminate that there are possible alternatives of being, but also of producing knowledge. Now, this is great, right? Because, the people who need to engage in most reflection around these processes are researchers from the global north and from elite institutions. But some of the pitfalls of this strategy is that the conversation might become this very sterilized, academic jerk circle for the most part, It's just a bunch of academics talking about how, important it is. Like right now, I'm an academic talking about this. Hopefully I'm doing it, but academics talking about how important it is to decolonize knowledge, holding conferences. I'll give an example. Last year, I'm a member of the International Society for Political Psychology. I actually am not a member anymore because I refuse to pay them money because of how Israeli-dominated that association is, right? So political psychology, a lot of political psychologists are Israeli. And the way in which they frame their rhetoric, they're very progressive. They're liberal Israelis. They're liberal Zionists who love to do research on how to make relationships between Israelis and Palestinians more harmonious, right? So they frame the entire settler colonial context of Palestine as one of intergroup conflict, as if, both sides have equal power, equal resources, and an equal positionality in their existence. And they're heavily represented in this organization. Last year in the summer, in their annual conference, their theme was decolonizing political psychology, right? So they wanted to center ideas on decolonial processes. They had a lot of researchers from Latin America, which is where most of the decolonial work in psychology is coming from. My colleagues, a group of Arab colleagues and I, were a little weirded out by it, right? Because we know what this organization is like. So we went through every single abstract of a paper that was accepted in that conference that talked about Palestine in any way. Every single one of those abstracts, except one, was produced by Israeli researchers from Israeli organizations. Every single one of those abstracts framed the settler colonial reality of Palestine as intergroup conflict. So even though this organization, was so happy and boasting about how they're putting forth a conversation on decoloniality, they were really perpetuating colonial hegemony in the context of Palestine. So my friends and I boycotted, wrote a position paper, spread it. We got some support, but everybody just was quiet after that. Zero action was taken, no reflection, no statements on part of the organization. So the message is very clear. They did that only for clout, just to say we're working on decolonial issues rather than to actually think through what decolonizing our field actually means. So that is the biggest pitfall of denaturalization. It becomes something like what ISPP did. A sanitized conversation from academics, from colonial settings, talking about how virtuous they are because they're thinking about decolonial processes and nothing else. Okay, so that was a little bleak. So maybe I'll talk about some paths forward and then we can have an open discussion with any questions, any thoughts, anything that you'd like to add. These are very general and I just, threw them out there because they summarize some of the points that I mentioned throughout the whole talk. One of the ways forward is to first acknowledge the epistemic violence that is perpetuated by the coloniality of knowledge. We need to acknowledge our role as colonial subjects in perpetuating that epistemic hegemony as well. We need to encourage and practice and think through and collaborate with others who are doing indigenous resistance in the ways that they are producing knowledge. These might not be your usual suspects, it might not be your academic collaborator from an academic institution. It might be your comrade and your political organizing group. And we can start trying to disrupt mainstream means of knowledge production. And one of the first ways we can do that is إنه نبلش نطلع أبحاثنا وأفكارنا ومعلوماتنا بالعربي. That's one of our starting points here. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to, if this is my email, if you have any questions or you'd like to collaborate, if you have any research ideas. But I'm done with my part, and the floor is open for all of you. Thank you. Time for some عرق. Question?